On the evening of November the 24th, 2009, an amateur caver by the name of John Jones took a trip with his brother Josh to Utah County to tackle the Nutty Putty cave, a local cave infamous for its narrow and slippery passageways. What John didn't know is that the trip would end in disaster and tragedy. John Edward Jones was part of a very big family. He was one of 5 boys and also had 2 sisters. His extended family even consisted of 16 nieces and nephews. He was a devout Christian and had a loving family, with 1 child and his wife Emily Jones Sanchez pregnant with their 2nd child. Wanting to have a successful and stable career, John was studying to become a paediatric cardiologist at the time. When John himself was a child, he used to love exploring caves with his brother. His father regularly took them both on spelunking trips all over Utah, their home state. However, with his newfound family life and being busy with his studies, John couldn't find much time to indulge his hobby in later years. John and Josh decided to take a caving trip for old time's sake and chose the local Nutty Putty cave as the location. The cave was well known to locals and was first explored in 1960. It was a notoriously challenging area to explore, with tight twists and turns running all along the close to 1,400 feet of narrow tunnels. In its heyday, as many as 25,000 people per year visited the cave. The different parts of the cave had very unique names. Left from the entrance, you had the maze, then the big room, and finally the crack. Right of the entrance had narrower and more winding passageways, called the Big Slide, the Birth Canal, the Aorta Crawl, and Vein Alley. Before 2009, this cave had 4 separate rescues of cavers and Boy Scouts who got stuck inside the cave's tight twists, turns and crawls. In 2006, an effort was made to study and severely limit the number of visitors allowed inside the cave. Many visitors often entered the cave late at night and failed to take proper safety precautions. John and his brother made plans to tackle the cave with a large group of 9 friends as a fun excursion just a few days before the family would get together for Thanksgiving. The group gathered as agreed at 8 p.m. outside the cave and started exploring. For the first hour, the expedition was everything they had hoped for. The party had successfully explored and navigated the Big Slide, the largest area in the cave. However, talk soon turned to a challenge that they had heard about previously, attempting to pass through a narrow area aptly known as the Birth Canal. This was a challenging spot to navigate, but shouldn't have been a challenge for such seasoned cavers. Besides, once they got through, it would eventually open up into a larger room for them to explore. Wanting to take the lead, John went first. He entered the tight passageway and continued inching forward for some time, but he didn't see anywhere where the area opened up again. In fact, there was an abrupt downward turn in the small tunnel. Assuming that the larger space was just around the corner, John continued to press on in earnest. What he didn't know was that he had already made a fatal mistake. Rather than being in the birth canal, somehow John had managed to crawl into an even narrower pathway as an offshoot from the main tunnel, called Ed's Push. This tiny tunnel doesn't lead into a larger room. In fact, it doesn't lead anywhere at all, with John now having to crawl downwards with no room to turn around. He had no choice but to keep pushing through. Eventually, he found himself stuck upside down in a small space that measured 10 by 18 inches at its smallest. If you need some comparison, it's the equivalent of trying to squeeze yourself through the front door of a washing machine. With his brother following some distance behind, Josh did his best to pull John out by his legs. With gravity working full force against his body weight, any attempts were in vain, as he would instantly slide back down into the tiny crevice. Josh managed to inch backwards out of the passage in order to urgently find help. At midnight, a local rescue volunteer was the first to arrive at the scene and rushed towards John's location. He had now been trapped upside down, with blood pooling in the upper half of his body, for 3 hours. John was still trapped 400 feet into the cave and 100 feet below the Earth's surface. Getting people, equipment and supplies down that far took an hour. Into the early hours of the morning, dozens of other people arrived in an attempt to rescue him. After spending some time discussing the best course of action, they soon settled upon trying to use a rescue rope to try and forcibly pull him out. In an attempt to make the procedure easier, they also tried to remove pieces of the passage wall, although they hardly made any progress at all due to the hardness of the rock and the extremely awkward positioning. As the cave area was so narrow, only one person could directly access John at one time. This severely hampered the rescue attempts. The rescue team were fighting against the clock, as John was in a truly precarious position. He was starting to have difficulty breathing due to the constricted space, and the upright position of his body was putting tremendous strain on his heart, as it was needing to keep blood from pooling in his brain. With no success thus far, John had now been trapped in this terrifying position for 19 hours. The group of rescuers managed to lower a two-way radio into the crevice for him to speak to his concerned wife. Soon after, an elaborate pulley system had been installed in order to pull John out. It took the strength of 8 people to use it, but they started to pull him upwards by his legs in short bursts. After 3 successful motions, the group had managed to extract him sufficiently so he could look at the rescuer closest to him. After having a short rest and a brief conversation with John, the group gathered their strength and prepared to finish the job. It was then that disaster struck. All of a sudden, as the group pulled for a final time, the rope instantly slackened and a cloud of fine dust exploded into the air. When constructing the pulley, the group had tied the rope around a thick stone arch to support his weight. Once the dust and the initial shock had cleared, the rescuers were devastated to discover that the arch had shattered, plunging John back down into the crevice even deeper than before. With the situation now a medical emergency, the rescuers that weren't injured by the catastrophe tried desperately to check on John's health. After one of them managed to make contact, worryingly, his breathing had become much more shallow and less frequent. He was now in a critical condition. At this point, the group tried their utmost to remove John, but every attempt was unsuccessful. Calling for him at the top of their voices, they eventually received no response and couldn't make contact. They weren't sure if he had passed out from the severe stress on his body or something worse. Shortly before midnight, a full 27 hours since the disaster had occurred, a medical professional entered the cave and somehow managed to reach John. Tragically, he was pronounced dead due to cardiac arrest. John was just 26 years old. His family thanked rescuers for their help, even despite the horrible news. The next day, the local authorities performed an investigation and came to the conclusion it was much too dangerous to remove the body from the cave due to fears of further injury or fatalities. Just a week after the horrible accident, Nutty Putty Cave was closed to the public permanently, having been sealed ever since. The body of John Jones remains trapped underground to this day. John's family had a plaque put on the entrance of the cave in his memory, both to commemorate and remember their cherished son, father and husband, and also to act as a macabre warning to other would-be cavers of the tremendous dangers involved in the pastime.